The reading section 822 through 832, facing off with the Soviet Union. Many of the successes of Eisenhower's administrations were what did not happen, which technically is the case with a lot of presidencies. Things that we don't know about, things that didn't happen that were stopped. He did not dismantle the New Deal social programs. He kept those intact. Eisenhower also extended U.S. and political power around the world, but didn't go to war. Now, I'm sure we were on the brink of going to war quite a few times, which will lead us to the topic of conversation of facing off with the Soviet Union. But we did not enter into a full-scale war against the Soviet Union. This Eisenhower's administration of massive retaliation controlled military spending, but stressed the use of nuclear weapons. We're going to send everything we got. We'll push them to the brink before we go to war. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which is the first artificial satellite launched into space. We try to send one up not long after that, and it fails. We end up sending one up, but we are way behind the Soviets. This starts the space race. It also passes the National Defense Education Act to expand college and postgraduate education. It also meant the new National Aeronautical and Space Administration took over the satellite program, but schooling got a big bump here. Kids had to learn upper-level math, upper-level science, try to get kids involved in those fields so that they could choose those careers and push us towards being on the scientific frontier or the technological frontier. Here's a meeting between Khrushchev and Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, and what was, under Eisenhower, Nixon is the vice president, Nixon. Here students are ducking and covering for a nuclear test. Eisenhower and Truman's foreign policies had much in common. Containment, containment, containment. We reserved the right to intervene in any affair in any other nation. We subverted democratically elected governments in Iran and Guatemala. The reason why we know that is because they failed, because the people we wanted in place weren't going to win, so therefore we backed our people, and it ends up being worse. Guatemala goes through a civil war. Iran, we have issues with later that we're going to talk about. We don't really talk about Guatemala anymore, but Iran we will. Eisenhower helped resolve the Korean War, diffused the controversy over the shelling of Quemoy and Matsu by rattling our nuclear saber. Now, obviously, he's not rattling an actual saber, but it's kind of like the idea with Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly but carry a big stick. We say, hey, guys, knock it off. We got nuclear weapons. We got them here. You might want to stop. He also helped solve the Suez Canal crisis, where the Suez Canal was built in Egypt by France and Great Britain. The Egyptians try to take it over. There's a problem because Egypt is backed by the Soviet Union. Cooler heads prevail. And the British still get to run, the British and French get to run the Suez Canal. The Egyptians just get better terms. We don't go to full-scale war. There's no full-scale war going. It also kept us out of challenges to communist rule in Eastern Europe. We just stayed out of it. We know things are going to get bad and worse in those areas. We'll talk about this in a little bit. The Soviet Union, China, and the United States misinterpreted each other's motivations and diplomatic signals in several terrible crises. We had what was before satellite technology. We had spy planes, and they were the U-2 spy planes. And we thought we flew higher and faster than anybody could shoot us out of the sky. And unfortunately, at a time when Eisenhower and Khrushchev are about to sit down and have conversations about disarmament, one of our planes gets shot down over the Soviet Union. And of course, it causes many problems. But again, let's hit on this again. Foreign policy for Eisenhower is containment, containment, containment. Continuity meant that every independence movement and social revolution was considered part of competition with the communism, and it also created unnecessary problems. Eisenhower leaves office gives it to John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy runs against Nixon. He's young, vibrant, from Boston, New England area. He is the antithesis of Nixon, but he leaves a lot of Cold War issues. Eisenhower leaves a lot of Cold War issues for Kennedy to deal with. Kennedy does a pretty good job of leading the nation towards a new frontier of science and social progress, but he also has a whole bunch of failures in the Cold War arena, for lack of a better term, as well as he has some successes. Kennedy barely beats Nixon. What it comes down to is the big issues are Kennedy is Catholic. He's younger. This was the first presidential debate on live television. Kennedy, if you're on live television, you're under those lights, you wear makeup. Kennedy looks young, vibrant, ready to go. Nixon looks old. He's sweating. He's pale. The funny thing is that the people that listened to the debate on the radio thought Nixon won. The people that watched the debate on TV thought Kennedy won. And so he wins by a very, very small margin. Kennedy brings new energy to the White House, but behind the scenes, he's really sick. The exact opposite is true. Everybody thought that he was really healthy and vibrant looking, but he's been really sick. Bad back. He's got a lot of issues. He also does some weird things. I guess he's trying to counterbalance himself. He comes up with the Peace Corps, which is really awesome. You give up 4 to 6 years of your life. You go and promote peace or volunteer for that period of time in some poor country. But he also approves plans to assassinate Fidel Castro, unsuccessfully, but it's just kind of a mess. Here you can see here, he barely wins. It's a very slim majority. He actually has to come out and tell the people that he will not go to the Pope for advice because he is the first Catholic president, with the whole idea of separation of church and state. Here is the Kennedys. Jackie Kennedy, JFK's wife. She modernizes the idea of being a first lady. She completely redecorates the White House, makes the White House into what it is today. And they're young. It's one of the first times we've seen, in a long time or at all, the president being younger, having young children. And it's kind of nice for America to have this because Eisenhower was really old compared to JFK. Some Cuban nationalists who live in America want to take back Cuba. And unfortunately for them, and we'll discuss it in class in greater detail, but unfortunately for them, it's a failure. We do not give them air support, even though we promised it. It's a nightmare from the beginning. And it shows that Kennedy is vulnerable. Berlin starts to, so then Khrushchev comes up with this whole idea for Berlin. Let's, we're not going to cut out the road. Let's build the wall. And so he fails in the beginning, and he's going to have to come out as a president and literally gets on national television and does an interview and says, I failed. The Bay of Pigs was a complete and utter failure. Now, he's going to have some successes here, but in this instance, he fails. Now, we do get into Vietnam. In 1954, the U.S. strengthens our containment policy where we signed SEATO, or Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. And Kennedy backs Diem. Diem is in the south. In the north is Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh is a communist. In the south is Diem. We don't like all of his policies. However, he's pro-American, pro-democracy. The whole idea is they're going to split into two countries. After a year, they're going to have a nationwide vote. And Diem will run against Ho Chi Minh. And then Diem decides that he's not going to have this nationwide vote because he thinks he's going to lose. Viet Cong here, good vocabulary word. These are the communist rebels in South Vietnam who fought the Americans. So the followers of Ho Chi Minh are called the Viet Minh. Those are the northern Vietnamese. And then in the South, if you followed if you followed Ho Chi Minh, you were known as the Viet Cong. And we'll get into more detail, of course, about that once we talk about the Vietnam War. In 1962, the United States discovered the Soviets were building missile silos in Cuba. We come to find out that the only thing they don't have is the quote-unquote computer that they need to actually launch these missiles. And that being in Cuba, they're close, which is a scary proposition for the United States. They can hit mainland United States within minutes instead of hours. And so we blockade Cuba, and everybody freaks out because the Soviet ships are coming their way. And we tell them that you don't try to cross this blockade that's around Cuba. If you do, there's going to be consequences. Americans start fleeing. It's worse than, an ice, what is going to be a snowstorm in Texarkana. All the chips and everything are milk and bread and lunch meat are all gone off the shelves. And as the Soviet ships are coming in, eventually the Soviet ships do stop, and the United Nations comes in and removes those weapons from Cuba. And then we remove our weapons from Turkey, which are close enough proximity of what Cuba is to the United States between Turkey and the Soviet Union. In 1961, Kennedy began the Alliance for Progress, which was an economic development program for Latin America. Basically, we're going to aid Latin America so that they don't fall to communism or Castroism. It's basically what we did with the Truman Doctrine. It's basically what we did with the Marshall Plan. Give money to these countries so they can build themselves up so they don't fall to communism. The United States played catch up with the Soviet Union in the space race, as I said. But Kennedy provided momentum by promising to land a human on the moon by the end of the decade, as he would say, or decade. In 1961, the Soviet Union and the United States resumed nuclear testing. So it's not going to stop. I mean, it's an arms race. It's a space race. It's an arms race. It's a nuclear race. What can we do to have something that's better than them? And for us, it's actually beneficial. We're spending a lot of money, but that's a capitalistic society. For them, spending a lot of money in the Soviet Union is not good for them. So there's lots of issues going on here, and it's hurting, for lack of a better term, the Soviet Union. We do sign the Limited Test Ban Treaty with the Soviet Union, which outlaws nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater. We don't need to do these anymore. Let's not kill all the fish. Let's not blow a hole in the ozone. Let's not end the world. And so we stop this test ban treaty. And that's the end of the lecture video 822 through 832. And we'll pick up with civil rights movement next time.